Many years ago, I was someone who stretched constantly. Every day after I trained, I would literally go back to my dorm at my college and I would stretch for an hour. I would do 20 minutes, literally 20 minutes in 3 different positions because I wanted my hips to be more mobile. And this was all to no avail. I did it for a long time and it didn't work. So today I'm going to present to you 3 reasons why you shouldn't be stretching and then potential counter arguments to that, because I think it's nice to have a sort of balanced approach to this conversation and to not just sort of sit on either side of the fence. Whether you're pro stretching or anti-stretching, I think the answer oftentimes is somewhere in the middle. So the first thing that we need to talk about is the goal. Why are you stretching? Okay. And again, this is the sort of reasons not to stretch. And then we'll talk about maybe cases where it could be appropriate. So assuming that on this side of the coin, i.e. the anti-stretch side of the coin, the first reason that I wouldn't stretch is if someone told me to. Now, why does this matter? Why is it important? Well, because oftentimes when someone tells you to do something, think about this in another domain, the nutrition space. Oftentimes it's a family member you see a couple times a year, or a friend you see occasionally who's saying, bro, you gotta eat this food. Bro, you gotta take this supplement. You need to be eating this particular fruit. Bro, stay away from that fruit, right? All these kinds of claims often come from people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Now, if you're working with a professional and that professional is competent, experienced, and is helping you with a very specific goal or problem that you're experiencing, totally different story. But a vast majority of the time, if you've never questioned the idea that you actually don't need to stretch to have a healthy, functioning body, then you should start to ask yourself that question. And just from a research perspective, there isn't anything that basically says, hey, you need to stretch to have good physical health, right? Unlike the markers that we do understand are closely associated with health and longevity. For example, like VO2 max, in other words, your cardiorespiratory capacity, your overall levels of strength. Those things are very tightly associated with being a healthier human overall. Stretching is yet, at least in the research, as far as we currently understand, to actually bridge that gap and make that link. So the number one reason not to stretch is really because people told you to. In other words, if you lived your whole life being convinced that you need to, this is Ben telling you and giving you the permission to say, hey, I don't really need to do this anymore if I don't want to, right? Because oftentimes people don't want to and they just feel like they have to, okay? So you don't have to. Now, the second reason not to is if you are already lifting on a consistent basis. And not only that, if you are lifting through all different kinds of ranges of motion and challenges. Now, full range of motion is a very sort of catchy, smoke bomby topic, because what is full range of motion? Are we referring to a joint, a muscle, both, right? It really varies. Are we just referring to an exercise, again, or are we talking more specific? And oftentimes the way that I frame it to people who are in this sort of first category of someone told me to, or the culture told me to, so therefore I have to, I start, of course, by asking them like, oh, why do you think that? But then I also ask them like, well, what's the difference to you between stretching and lifting? Because in my estimation, like, you know, think about any stretch that you could do. There's a way to mimic that same joint position and those same stresses, those same sort of orchestrations of tension, if you will, in those stretch positions, and just to sort of add load to it, right? So imagine you are someone who wants to improve your ability to touch your toes for whatever reason. Maybe you like to bend over and tie your shoes and you want to not feel as restricted when you do that. Perfectly fine goal to have. Well, you could do a toe touch and just perpetually do toe touches, and you could probably get better at them. But you could also just do an exercise with load, let's say like an RDL, right, or a Jefferson curl, that you could actually load, progress, get stronger at, and become sort of more robust human being into that position, given that you're actually able to use load and use load to progress the motion beyond just perpetually trying to touch your toes. So the second reason to be sort of anti-stretch, if you will, is if you're someone who's already highly active, you're doing your cardio, you're getting your daily steps, you're lifting, and you're lifting through a variety of ranges. You're not sort of in this fear-based mindset that says you have to avoid particular positions, right? If you're someone who is already doing this and you're already checking these boxes, I don't personally see a reason to stretch unless, as we'll talk about later, you have a very hyper-specific goal related to stretching. And then number three just comes down to joints, and specifically what I will refer to as a joint jam. Now, this is not to fearmonger. The word jam is kind of fearmongering. I don't mean to do that. But what I mean is that oftentimes people will stretch with the assumption that they can improve their mobility to infinity, right? And this is, again, is closely linked to this first one. But I just want to give a quick example at the ankle, right? Because ankle mobility is, like, for whatever reason, one of the most popular kinds to talk about. The thing about bones is that they have constraints. In other words, based on the shape of your bones and your unique anatomy, you may at some point have this bone run into this bone, right? Like this, okay? And when that happens, there's no more range to move in, right? And then to push beyond that is what I like to call a joint jam, which is basically like you are coming as close to approximating bone on bone as possible, right? Bones don't quite touch, at least in a sort of healthy joint, but you come as close as possible to that position, and you can't go any further, right? It's basically like you're just running into a wall. It's like you're gonna either have to stop and be like, all right, there's a wall here, or you're gonna have to break down the wall to continue to move. And a lot of people are getting to this point and trying to push past this point because they think that there's more to be had in all cases. When in reality, you might just have a particular bone structure. I know people who literally, if this is like a sort of 0 point, people standing, they can literally bend their ankle this far. And the reason is because if you look at like x-rays of their feet, they just have bones that are in the way. There's nothing they can do about it. So this idea that, and again, this is all sort of connected to this thing up here, the idea that you can just have mobility, possess mobility, and just gain it forever, right? It's not true. It's a lie. And in every context, there's some kind of stop point. And the same goes true for people who are like stretching gurus who are selling programs for people to get more flexible. And, on the front cover, it's like, hey, I'm doing this split. Look at my split. I can, bring my legs out 180 degrees, right? No one who doesn't have a very specific hip structure can actually ever achieve that position without having this specific arrangement of bones, right? There are some people who have very shallow hip sockets who can actually move their hips through that range. If you're someone who has a deeper hip socket, your femoral head or your femoral neck, which is really just to say, your whole thigh, your long thigh bone, that thigh bone will just run into the hip socket basically before you're able to do the split. So some of you who buy this $20 program to be able to do a split will just never be able to do it unless you actually really fuck yourself up in some way. So that's sort of the third reason that I would be anti-stretch. So over on this category, I've presented an argument sort of against stretching, and not necessarily like in a negative sense, but just in the sense that like, hey, you shouldn't feel like you need to stretch if this is you over here. And this is me over here. I lift, I'm active. Someone told me to a long time ago, I listened to it, it didn't work for what my intended goal was. And I don't like sort of feeling like I'm jamming my joints. Those are like my reasons. I don't really do it. If I want to, get loosey-goosey, I just change my joint positions. I have a standing desk. I go on a walk. I do those kinds of things. Now, what are some counter arguments, or not necessarily counter arguments, but just points in favor of stretching? When might it be appropriate to stretch? Well, the first thing that I can think of is if you have a very hyper-specific goal with this still kept in mind. So let's say that your goal is to be a jiu-jitsu athlete, right? And you really want to be able to bend your spine more to be able to get into certain positions that are advantageous to be able to get into in that particular sport. Or let's say you're a dancer and you want to become more flexible so that you can achieve particular positions, your turnout, right? Your splits, whatever it happens to be. You have a very hyper-specific goal and you're willing to sort of understand that, yes, there is a limit, and that pushing this limit and perpetually pushing that limit is something that may be detrimental to you, may or may not, in even the short term, but definitely the longer term. Right? I can't say for sure like whether or not you'll have problems, but a lot of people who have hyper-specific goals for sport in particular you just have to understand that it's a trade-off, right? And so your body has the ranges that it has and the ranges that are available to you right now for a specific reason, and we should ask what those reasons are before we start to go through this. Now, again, no judgment if you're someone who has this particular goal, by all means, and if you are a client of mine, I would be like, yeah, we're gonna stretch, we're gonna use loaded stretching, and we're gonna use long holds so that your body can actually adapt to these positions more and more. So that's a specific application where I'd be like, yeah, stretching makes sense. When does stretching also make sense? Because it doesn't have to be that extreme, right? Well, there are many people who just like it. And this, keep in mind, is very different from this, because there are, I would argue, a vast majority of the people are falling into this category. They have heard this thing their whole life. The culture says it. The science says it when it really doesn't, right? People are either lying about this or they just don't understand what the current body of evidence suggests. Not that I'm some sort of stretching research expert. If there are any of you who are watching this, please drop a comment, educate me, educate the rest of the audience. I'm always looking to learn more. But if you like it, if you like it in the same way that you like going for a walk, if you enjoy yoga specifically, if you enjoy, which is kind of like sort of stretching, kind of depends on the yoga, I guess. If it's just an activity that you like to golf, you like to stretch, right? Those are just activities. And if this is something that makes you feel good, it calms you down, it gets you ready for bed, it wakes you up in the morning, whatever it happens to be, go for it. You like it, no judgment about that. Just as long as you understand that in this particular case, there's not a hyper-specific goal. So probably don't push yourself too hard if you want to keep it as something that is enjoyable and that over the long term isn't potentially something that's maybe working against you. And the last specific application, and I think there are probably plenty more that I'm not thinking of, at least at the moment, I think it is in rehab. So there are very specific cases in which stretching, to the conversation we had here, is kind of like a less loaded form of lifting. In other words, if you are someone who has an injury, who is recovering from an injury, being able to sort of use and manipulate your own body is a lot easier than having to pick a selected weight and having to stick to a selected weight to perform an activity. Now, there may be cases in which exactly what you need is an external weight because let's say the weight of your arm is too much for your rotator cuff to handle after you just had a replacement, right? And so that's a totally different situation. Maybe you would need to lie on your side. Maybe you would need assistance to someone to help you lift your arm. Maybe you would need something like a cable moving in the opposite direction to help you lift the arm or to unload you in that particular instance. There's any number of instances, I think, in which stretching can be useful because we're just introducing tension into the system, right? If you have an Achilles replacement surgery, let's say, for example, you fully tear your Achilles off the bone and you have this reattachment, right? Being able to actually just very gently pull the heel in a downward direction is something that, via stretching the calves, can start to introduce some kind of mechanical stimulus for that thing to repair itself and for that thing to grow stronger and rebuild in a way that we would ideally want to see it be rebuilt. So these are instances, and of course there's a million different sort of variations within the category of rehab, and I don't think that it's right to just say rehab equals stretching or stretching equals rehab, but stretching can certainly be a component of this just as lifting can. And so I hope that this is somewhat informative just from a balanced perspective. I'm really interested to hear all of your thoughts and experiences on stretching. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're someone who really understands deeply the benefits of stretching in terms of what the actual research has said, if you can link me a PubMed article or a research review or whatever it is, I'm happy to read it, go over it, change any of the opinions that I have based on evidence that maybe can change the opinions that I have, at least as it currently stands. So again, please drop those comments. I'm really interested to hear what you all think about this.